Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experience and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self awareness. I am Artemis, enjoying a cup of spiced pear pie tea, courtesy of the Rosenvine Gift Company, as it is increasingly coming to my attention that the shocking headlines seen regarding activism associated with the LGBT community are becoming more and more frequent and vast in their scope. And even more concerning is the fact that the stated goals of these individuals do not at all embody my particular philosophies as someone who is technically a part of this community. And as I've talked to others like myself, I'm realizing that I'm not alone here. So I did a brief video about how the activists do not speak for me, so I'm keenly aware that I'm not speaking for everyone else here either. And while I've done videos on some of these separate issues, over time I've started to see a pattern with these news headlines, and I figured that it was time for some deeper study. And that rabbit hole had an alarming end, which has led me to do a video series, of which this video is the first. So to this point, I've not tied any of these news headlines or singular issues to a larger movement that we're going to call wokeism. However, after doing a deep dive into the origins of wokeism, I feel that it is crucially important to expose the insanely dangerous slope we are sliding ever faster down, caused by a very flawed ideology. For me, pulling all of these separate event news headlines together and understanding exactly where this movement came from, what it believes, and how it believes it will achieve success towards its goal is the key to being able to fight back against what I see coming, which will not only destroy the social progress that we've made, but will also send us hurtling towards another system of control, like that which cost so many lives during World War II. And yes, I do believe it to be that serious. If there really is such a thing as the silent majority, I'm speaking up in the midst because I believe that if I don't, so much more than rights and tolerance will be lost. Know the pitfall and understand it. So let me be crystal clear here. I'm not attacking individual people, and I'm not painting one political group to be right. This is not a right versus left. So much of what we are seeing today in public discourse and politics is one group pointing the finger at the other, each broadly painting huge groups of people to be the monsters that need destroyed, without ever acknowledging the nuance and the necessity for both sides. I strive in my videos to be mindful that each of us has the capacity to be that monster if we fail to find the common ground and label those with a different viewpoint as unworthy of life. If we allow ourselves to stay in that frenzied black and white thinking and make that kind of judgment without due process, this is what leads to mass casualties and sets us back as a society. The goal here is to identify the nuance by teasing out the twisted and flawed reasoning of the so-called logic of woke, and I aim to do that with each video in this miniseries. So, in this introductory video, I aim to give a summary of how the so-named woke ideology has been developing in the United States, starting from its roots, so that you can have a greater understanding of its manifestations today. I will continue to refer to it as wokeism, and here's why. Because left and right have been used in political and philosophical writings over the decades, and each has had its own evolution to a degree. And without a hard definition followed through time, it's tough to keep discourse on the same page. Plus, people will invoke their own cognitive biases associated with the words, muddying the message in general. I'm also attempting to avoid chucking moderate individuals of any philosophy or political bend in with the radical ideology that I'm talking about. So again, I'm separating people from ideas. Because let's face it, we've all made bad choices based on things we believed in at the time, and I'm not here to demonize people. In this mini-series following this video, while I could be kept busy for months just detailing all the ways in which we are seeing woke ideology in general play out in the United States, I'm only going to expose the woke roots of headline events within the LGBT sector. This is going to be my contribution to the community and a very direct message that someone within that community is not the source of such radical activism or radical ideology. It's my hope that if you are within the LGBT community, that you too are horrified by wokeism hijacking a label to which you are associated, and that you can arm yourself with this understanding and fight back before we lose the precious acceptance that was fought so hard to gain, and worse, end up in a state of totalitarian rule, like tyrannical activism has always ended. And if you're someone who stumbles across this information as anyone outside of the LGBT community, it's my hope that you learn that it's not the named labels within the community that are inherently the problem, i.e., it's not the transgenders, the gays, the lesbians, etc. Instead, it's this line of philosophy that perhaps at one time had aspects of a novel balancing theory to contribute. Now, it's tripping the red flag radar within so many of us, and it's time to speak up. Those who have adopted wokeism as a consuming identity will call me a bootlicker, which is to say a trans person sympathizing with cisgender, heteronormative people. And when the ad hominem fallacies come out, rest assured you're probably making a good point. At the very end of this video, I'm going to read a poem for you called The Hangman by Maurice Ogden. It was written in 1952, after all the atrocities of World War II had occurred, and the dust had settled, and people had time to reflect on what had led them to that point. This particular poem gave me great inspiration and a reminder for why it's so important to have courage and speak up. So, if you haven't heard the poem, if you might be interested in hearing it for the first time, or just hearing me read it, it will be at the end of this video. Okay, so here's the part where I'm going to briefly give highlights of the roots of wokeism. So the following videos in this series have enough context, starting with the death of God. Starting with a bang, we are. So Friedrich Nietzsche said that, quote unquote, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? What is the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe the blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? He said this in 1882, and the interpretation often stated is that a monumental shift was occurring in Western world culture. It was rolling to a more scientific understanding of the world, with far less religious reliance than had been seen in the golden ages of Christianity. People were putting their faith in science instead of an idea of God, and questioning or tearing down all codes of conduct associated with religion with this new evidence of life that they could now observe like never before. This ideology then becomes a new religion, and the status of God can be passed to anyone using science as their means to an end. This could be government, in any institution, or any individual just the same, which can be just as dangerous as blind faith to an omnipotent being. Now, while many philosophers had been influencing our methods of thinking since the time of the ancient Greeks, there was an explosion of new ideas from the 18th century into the 20th century with a lot of very notable philosophers. So during this time of cultural questioning, a German philosopher by the name of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel would begin to shape the new way of thinking with his intellectual musings. In the world of logic and critical thinking, we had been long exposed to Aristotle's method of problem solving that is called the dialectic, which was to bring two competing points together in an emotionless debate to arrive at a conclusion that was the best that could be made possible given the parameters. This new method of thinking and problem solving proposed by Hegel would be to incessantly challenge every conclusion made from a debate in order to progress history to an eventual goal of perfection. Perfection being the ever elusive utopia, which it wasn't necessarily called at the time, but as we move forward through history, that's what it would be labeled. And the realization of an absolute truth that had been distilled over and over to purity. You know, like that kind of distilled alcohol that's so pure that it's best used for combustion and not for consumption. Anyway, Hegel would also point out that being ever aware of the lens through which we are viewing problems was crucial, because those lenses could predetermine the solutions that we have available. It would be as if you were trying to start a fire because you were cold, and being warm would achieve a solution or utopia for you. But instead of trying to start a fire, you may well have solved the problem simply by moving to a warmer place. Now, I'm going to stop here to make a very, very important statement. I believe that it's good practice to question what you believe in the face of solid evidence so as never to become too stagnant in your ways. I also believe that there is wisdom to be gleaned from, albeit religious texts that have been around for hundreds or even thousands of years, even if they have been used to justify some terrible means by certain people. The answer, for now, I believe, always lies somewhere in the middle and is never perfect, because there is no such thing as an absolute truth among humans when there exists such complexity of individual consciousness and subjective judgment of goals. Having said that, woke of today would disagree with me and follow Hegel's framework, calling their dialectical method critical theory, being consistently critical of a conclusion to the point of cannibalizing their own assertions about social power dynamics. However, instead of hungering for the absolute truth at the core of this questioning, these days it has become a grab for who can claim the MVV, the most valuable victim card, and gain their sense of power from, ironically, shaming others who they claim to have power over them. It's kind of twisted. They then can further distill and cherry pick their ideas from philosophers that came shortly after Hegel, like Karl Marx and those of the Frankfurt School such as Herbert Marcuse, and fringe thinkers like Michel Foucault, to arrive at the Frankenstein we now see here in the 21st century, which I'm calling woke. So, in grossly oversimplified summary, they would take Karl Marx's idea that there was a system of an elite group of people oppressing a poorer populace by controlling resources, Marcuse's idea that the populace was too stupid to see when they were being oppressed and needed an intellectual savior to reprogram their thought patterns, and Foucault's idea that we should all be so liberated as to be able to give the power of sexual consent to children under 15 years old. This is how you get the notion that certain races of people are responsible for the failures of other races, that we need a government given the status of God to tell us what is good for us, and drag queen story time that teaches children how to twerk.
It's all in. And then you just move your bum up and down like that, and that's twerking.
God, I wish I was making this up. I'd love to be talking about so many other things on this channel, and someday soon, I hope to be there. But in this mini-series following this video, I feel compelled to tackle these issues created by this monster of an ideology as it pertains to the LGBT sector, at least in both an attempt to avoid becoming the scapegoat for the disaster that I see coming, and empathize with those on all sides of the issue getting swept up in the storm of madness. So, let's spill the tea like it's 1773. This is the portion of the video where I will read The Hangman by Maurice Ogden. Into our town the hangman came, smelling of gold and blood and flame, and he placed our bricks with a diffident air and built his frame on the courthouse square. The scaffold stood by the courthouse side, only as wide as the door was wide, a frame as tall, or little more, than the capping sill of the courthouse door. And we wondered, whenever we had the time, who the criminal and what the crime. That hangman judged with the yellow twist of knotted hemp in his busy fist. And innocent though we were, with dread we passed those eyes of buckshot lead, till one cried, "Hangman, who is he for whom you raise the gallows tree?" Then a twinkle grew in the buckshot eye, and he gave us a riddle instead of a reply. "He who serves me best," said he, "shall earn the rope on the gallows tree." And he stepped down and laid his hand on a man who came from another land. And we breathed again, for another's grief at the hangman's hand was our relief. And the gallows frame on the courthouse lawn by tomorrow's sun would be struck and gone. So we gave him way, and no one spoke, out of respect for his hangman's cloak. The next day's sun looked mildly down on roof and street in our quiet town. And, stark and black in the morning air, the gallows tree on the courthouse square. And the hangman stood at his usual stand, with the yellow hemp in his busy hand, with his buckshot eye and his jaw like a pike, and his air so knowing and businesslike. And we cried, "Hangman, have you not done yesterday with the alien one?" Then we fell silent and stood amazed. Oh, not for him was the gallows raised. He laughed a laugh as he looked at us. "Did you think I'd gone to all this fuss to hang one man? That's a thing I do, to stretch the rope when the rope is new." Then one cried, "Murderer," one cried, "Shame." And into our midst the hangman came, to that man's place. "Do you hold," said he, "with him that's meant for the gallows tree?" And he laid his hand on that one's arm, and we shrank back in quick alarm. And we gave him way, no one spoke, out of fear for his hangman's cloak. That night we saw, with dread and surprise, the hangman's scaffold had grown in size. Fed by the blood beneath the chute, the gallows tree had taken root. Now as wide, or a little more, than the steps that led to the courthouse door. As tall as the writing, or nearly as tall, halfway up the courthouse wall. The third he took, and we had all heard tell, was a usurer and an infidel. And, "What," said the hangman, "have you to do with the gallows bound, and he a Jew?" And we cried out, "Is this one he who has served you well and faithfully?" The hangman smiled. "It's a clever scheme to try the strength of the gallows beam." The fourth man's dark, accusing song had scratched out comfort hard and long, and, "What concern," he gave us back, "have you for the doomed and black?" The fifth, the sixth, and we cried again, "Hangman, hangman, is this the man?" "It's a trick," he said, "that we hangmen know, for easing the trap when the trap springs slow." And so we ceased and asked no more, as the hangman tallied his bloody score, and sun by sun, night by night, the gallows grew to monstrous height. The wings of the scaffold opened wide till they covered the square from side to side, and the monster crossbeam, looking down, cast its shadow across the town. Then through the town the hangman came, and called in the empty streets my name. And I looked at the gallows soaring tall, and thought, there is no left at all for hanging, and so he calls to me to help him pull down the gallows tree. And I went out with right good hope to the hangman's tree and the hangman's rope. He smiled at me as I came down to the courthouse square through the silent town. And supple and stretched in his busy hand was the yellow twist of them hempen strand. And he whistled his tune as he tried the trap, and it sprang down with a ready snap. And then with a smile of awful command, he laid his hand upon my hand. "You tricked me, hangman," I I shouted then, that your scaffold was built for other men, and I no henchman of yours, I cried. You lied to me, hangman, you foully lied. Then a twinkle grew in his buckshot eye. Lied to you? Tricked you? He said, not I. For I answered straight, and I told you true. The scaffold was raised for none but you. For who has served me faithfully than you with your coward's hope? Said he. And where are the others that might have stood side by your side in the common good? Dead, I whispered, and amiably. Murdered, the hangman corrected me. First the alien, then the Jew. I did no more than you let me do. Beneath the beam that blocked the sky, none had stood so alone as I. And the hangman strapped me, and no voice there cried, stay, for me in this empty square.